It's now time for the final project, and in this project, we're going to be building a flag of Laos using only CSS and HTML. If you take a look at this image, it looks like an oil painting, right? But actually, if you look behind the scenes, this is created completely just with HTML and CSS, which is completely crazy. If you head over to this URL, you'll see the portfolio of Diana Adrian, who is a CSS artist. And if you right-click on this image and you inspect it, you can see that all aspects of this painting is all created using CSS, which is completely mind-blowing. For example, if we take a look at something really simple, the hair here, you can see there are like a million divs in here, each strand having a div. And then if you look inside each strand, you can see they've got border radius set, width, height, different colors, etc. And it's this crazy complex CSS art. If you're not into oil paintings, then maybe you're into The Simpsons. These images of The Simpsons were all created using CSS. And if you head over to this URL, then you can actually click on each of these characters and you can see the CSS that was used to create them. And it's not surprising that it's a ton of CSS to write. So don't worry, this is not your challenge. We're not going to be creating something crazy like Krusty the Clown with 875 lines of CSS. It's just for you to be aware of the power of CSS. And once we learn the different ways of combining selectors, of the specificity of CSS selectors, positioning things, different properties, you can in fact eventually create crazy stuff like this if you have a ton of time and probably an artistic streak as well. Most of the time when I work with CSS, my results look like this weird Pikachu where things are not positioned correctly and everything's just moving in the wrong directions. So you're not alone. Most people write CSS code that creates weird Pikachus. The important thing is we understand why we get weird Pikachus and why the eyeballs are so far down. So we're going to consolidate what we learned in this lesson by creating the flag of Laos. And this is going to test everything you've learned about combining different CSS selectors, about CSS specificity, the CSS cascade, and also about positioning. And in the end, we will have this beautiful picture of the flag of Laos. Go ahead and download the starting project files and extract it. Now here, if you open up the index.html, you will see some very simple HTML that I've already set up for you. And if you preview it on the right, you'll see it has pretty much nothing, which is a great starting point for your project. The important thing is you don't change any of the HTML, so don't touch the index.html file at all. It's purposely vague in terms of classes and IDs, and nothing is really tagged with anything, right? And this is because we're doing a challenge, right? You could, of course, add loads of classes, loads of IDs, and make this project super, super easy. But I want to test you on what you've learned so far. So that's why the initial index.html has basically nothing for you to be able to target with your selector. Instead, you have to be a little bit more crafty. What we're aiming for is this. The flag doesn't have to be centered or positioned in any sort of particular way. This is going to be the top left corner right here, and then it's going to be a sort of rectangle that occupies part of your website. But the important thing is that it has these different aspects to it. It's got a red section here, which is 50% of this blue section here. And then it's got another red section down here, which is also similar in terms of how much it occupies. And how it works is there is a big red div right here, and above it, there is this blue div on top. So that should already help you in terms of how this layout should look. Now, the next thing is we've got a paragraph element that's located at the top, and we've got another paragraph element that has to be inside a white circle. If you take a look inside the index.html, you'll notice that there are some hints in here. For example, the width and height of the flag, and also the width and height of the circle. If you want to get hold of the precise colors, remember previously we learned about CSS inspection, and I've added a URL in here for you to be able to inspect on the actual image of the flag of Laos. This will test you on something you've learned previously as well. Remember, you can also right-click on the solution without opening the file and show it as a preview. And you can, of course, take the URL from VS Code and paste it inside your browser in order to see what the final outcome should look like, so you can better compare your version versus this version. You can do this in many, many different ways. And the main thing I want to know is that you know how to combine selectors, you know about CSS specificity, and you know how to position things roughly on screen. Once you're ready, pause the video and complete the project. All right, let's go through the solution together. The first thing is to style the outermost div, which has a class of flag. So this is probably going to be the easiest part of this whole project. We can target that div and set it to be 900 pixels wide and 600 pixels high so that we have a rectangle. Now next, we're going to have to set the background color so we can actually see it so that it's not white. In order to get the colors of the flag, remember I said we should inspect on it, and then we can go into the three dots, more tools, CSS overview, and if we capture the overview, we'll get our hex code. So the red, which is our first box, has this hex code, which I'm going to copy and then paste into here. And now we have a very large rectangle in our preview. Now the next step is to add this second rectangle on top of it. If we take a look at our HTML, you can see we've got a div with class flag as the highest most div. And then we've got as its children a paragraph element and another div. And then we've got finally another div and a paragraph element. So this second div enclosed is going to be the one that we're going to turn blue. Remember I said we can't change any HTML. So we can't add any classes or IDs to it. Instead, we're going to combine some selectors to select this particular div. So what is an identifying feature of it? Well, it is the direct descendant, the immediate child of this div class. So we can use the child combination by saying, let's get the class flag and then the angle bracket and then the child div. And in this div, we're going to go ahead and give it a width and a height. The width, we want it to be 100% of its parent. So I'm just going to write 100% and it should end up being 900 pixels. Alternatively, you can write the pixel number. Next, we're going to give it a height and I'm going to say 300 pixels. This way it takes up exactly half the height of the big red part. Now we just need to give it a background color in order to see it, and the color is going to be this blue color. And there we have it. We have a blue rectangle inside a red rectangle. Before we get busy positioning things, let's just make sure that we've got everything on screen first. So I want the circle to show up. And coming back to our HTML, you can see we've got one div. This is the red rectangle. Inside there's another div, which is the blue rectangle. And finally inside that, we've got another div, which we're going to turn into the circle. How do we get hold of this one? Well, we could use the descendant selector because this div is the immediate child of this div, which is then a child of this div. So we're saying it's 3 levels down. And we can do that by saying the flag class has a child, which is a div, which has another child, which is a div. And this particular div, we're going to give it a width of 200 pixels and a height of 200 pixels. And we're going to give it a background color of white. And we should now see a little square here. And in order to turn it into a circle, we set the border radius to 50%. So now we've got all 3 shapes on screen and it's time to try and position them so they look a bit more like this. Notice that this blue rectangle is not only half the size of the rectangle, but it's also shifted down by 1/4. So we want to set its position. Now, as I mentioned, in order to set the position of an element relative to a parent, what you need is for the child element, so in this case, this rectangle that's inside this blue rectangle that's inside the red rectangle, to have a position type of absolute. And then if its parent has a position type of relative, then we can now set this blue rectangle relative to this red rectangle. So we can say from the top, let's shift it down by 150 pixels, which is a quarter of 900 pixels. Even though we set this red rectangle to have position relative and we didn't move it at all, by setting it to relative, it enables us to modify the children's position relative to that parent. And this is why you'll very commonly see this structure, a parent having position relative and a child having position absolute. And then we move it relative to the parent. Using the same strategy, we can do the same thing for our circle, because our circle basically has to be in the middle of the red rectangle. If we set the position of this white circle to be position relative, then we can set it relative to its parent, which is the blue rectangle. So in order to move it to the center of the blue rectangle, we have to shift it down, so from the top, by 50 pixels, because if we know that this height is 300 pixels, then half of it is going to be 150. So then if we know that the radius of this circle is 100 pixels, because it's got a total height of 200 and a width of 200, then we know that in order for it to be in the center, it needs to be 50 pixels from the top. And by a similar calculation, we can work out that it needs to be 350 pixels from the left. Even though we did all our calculations correctly, you can see this white circle doesn't quite look like it's right in the middle of this blue rectangle, right? It's a little bit shifted to the lower part. So we can diagnose our issues using pesticide. In this case, you can see that we've got a div here, but we've also got a box above it, and this is the paragraph element. And if we go ahead and inspect it inside the Chrome inspector, you can see that paragraph element has a margin top and margin bottom. And if I go ahead and delete both of those margins, then you can see our circle shifts bang into the middle. So it's actually the margin around the paragraph element that's actually pushing the circle down, because it is within the flow of the HTML, because by default, all elements are statically placed in the flow of HTML. Let's go ahead and implement that in our code. We can select all the paragraph elements and set their margin to 0. And you can see immediately our circle is now centered in the screen. In addition, if we look at the goal image, we want to have the text super large. You can play around with the font size, but the one that I used is 5 rem. And this will get you pretty much the same size that you see here. In addition, the text is centered both inside the circle and at the top. So we need to set our text align to center, and that gets it pretty much where it needs to be. Now, the very last thing we need to do is to change the color of this part to white and this part to black. One way that we could do it is to simply set the color for all the text to white, and this will turn everything white and we'll no longer be able to see this text, even though it does exist. And if we wanted to select that particular paragraph element, we don't have a good way of selecting it with class or ID because we're not letting you change this HTML, but you can of course use different combinations to get there. For example, this paragraph element is a child of a div, of another div, of another div, of a body. There's actually a cheat code to doing this. If we open up the inspector and find that paragraph element we want to select, right-click on it, go to Copy, and then Copy Selector. Once you paste it in here, you'll see it's actually the selector that will allow us to target that exact bit that we wanted to. I don't recommend blindly copy and pasting things. So this is a little bit of a cheat code, but because we now understand how this works, we can actually simplify this massively. We know that what it's saying is find the body, find its child that's a div, find its child that's div, and then another child, and then 3 levels deep, there should be a paragraph tag, which needs to be black. Because we understand this, we can vastly simplify it by getting rid of that body, or we could change this to the class flag, which would do exactly the same. And we can even swap out these child symbols and keep it as a descendant selector. So a paragraph element that is a child of a div, a grandchild of another div, and a great grandchild of something that has this class, we'll select it and make it black. This is a little bit of a roundabout way of achieving the goal. You might have done something completely different. For example, we know that by default everything is black, so you could have also selected this paragraph element and turned it white instead. But I just wanted to demo to you a neat feature of Chrome Inspector, show you the cheat code after you've done the exercise, and let you know that this is also a possible way that you could try out in the future. So now if we compare our flag with the solution flag, you can see it's completely identical. Now, it might not be for you because maybe you've used a different method for positioning, maybe you've changed the font size to a different font size, but essentially you should be close to this layout. And hopefully in the process, you've managed to use some of the skills that you learned in this section. The inspiration for this project comes from a website I came across by Michael Laskaridis, and he basically classified world flags in order of difficulty to draw. So you can see all the way down here, there is Serbia, which is pretty much the most complex flag to draw because of the shield. And there are other countries like Croatia or Mexico, but at the very top, there are the simplest flags, for example, Palau or Nigeria or Peru. So if you want to have a go drawing your own country's flag, hopefully you're not in Serbia. If you are, then good luck. But if you're based in Austria or Bangladesh, then this should be quite doable using the skills that you've learned with CSS. Enjoy, and I'll see you on the next section.